Hey guys, welcome back to Builds by Maz. In this video, I'll be giving you a detailed instructional of how I made these plexiglass windows for my shed. Using plexiglass is a fast and inexpensive alternative to installing real glass windows, and I'll show you the whole process for how to do it yourself. Let's get started. First, I needed to remove and replace this old window in the front of the shed. It was broken and was held in place by this mesh fabric. If you want to skip ahead to just adding a window to a plain wall, go to 220 of the video. But for those of you who may have a similar old window that you want to remove, here's what I did. After taking off the mesh covering and removing all the nails, I had to decide how to get the window out. You can see it's going behind this paneling here, and it's held in place by these 2x4s in the back. My first idea was to try and pry up the edge of this siding and pull out the window from the front. This may work for you depending on your setup, but in my case, there were just too many nails, and this is where I decided it was going to be too much work. Instead, I was going to have to remove the frame from the back, which wasn't that much easier because there were some huge nails connecting this to the shed frame. I tried using my multi-tool first to cut through these nails, but they were too thick. Instead, I turned to my crowbar and slowly worked these 2x4s apart. If your frame is held together with screws, this would be a lot easier process. But as it was, I spent a lot of time slowly wiggling all these pieces until finally I could pry the whole window free. Now we'll be making the replacement window out of plexiglass. Right now it looks opaque, but that's just because there's a protective film on both sides, but the actual plexiglass is perfectly clear. You want to make sure you get something that's pretty thick. This here is a 1/4 inch. You could probably use 1/8 of an inch, but I wouldn't go any thinner than that, or it'll start getting flexible and flimsy. Here it's nice and durable, one solid piece so it'll be easy to work with. I'll put a link to this plexiglass that I got in the video description, but they came in 18 by 24 inch pieces, and I had some room to widen out this window, so I cut along the edges. With the front opening prepared, I then moved on to this back wall where there was no window at all. So my piece here is 18 by 24. Just doesn't quite fit in between the studs. I'm just gonna measure. This is 22.5. We'll just cut it down. We could put it this way if you want, but I want to go with the landscape. Now one of the great things about plexiglass is you can cut it really easily with a regular saw. You don't need a special glass cutter like you would with a real window. I wanted this window as large as possible, so I cut it to fit right in between these studs. I set it to the height I wanted, and after making sure it was level, I marked off the edges. Using a large drill bit, I drilled a hole inside where I'd marked my frame, so I had an entry point for my jigsaw. This way I could easily follow the lines I drew and cut out a hole for the window. This doesn't have to be absolutely perfect because we're going to be putting a frame around the outside anyway. I couldn't cut all the way to the edge, obviously because of the width of the saw, so I'm going to go to the outside and finish these cuts. Now remember, the goal here is to cut out a hole that's just barely wider than your plexiglass pane. Here I'm testing the size, and the plexiglass sheet just fits through the hole, which is perfect. Now we can move on to putting the trim in place. I got these 8-foot strips of 4-inch wide smart side trim, which will be going along the sides and bottom of the window. There needs to be at least a 1/2 inch overlap over each side of the plexiglass, because that's how it's going to be attached. So to determine the length of the header, I'm measuring the width of the plexiglass plus the extra trim on each side, accounting for the 1/2 inch overlap on both borders. For example, if your plexiglass is 20 inches wide, you're going to minus a 1/2 inch from each side for overlap, making it 19, plus 4 inches from each end of trim, making it a total of 27 inches long for the header piece. I cut the header to size and then installed it on the top of the window, making sure that it hung over the gap by 1/2 inch. I like starting with the header and making sure it's level before working down to the side pieces. Our whole thing's 18 inches. We've got a 1/2 inch overhang at the top and at the bottom. So that means each of these sideboards needs to be 17 inches. So 18 minus the 1/2 on each side gives you 17. If your header's in the right place, then these are pretty easy. Just make sure they're square, line up the edges, and drill them into place. See, we've got this lip here. So this is what the plexiglass is actually going to be resting against. The bottom trim piece should be the same length as the header, but I went ahead and measured just to make sure everything was still in line. I then repeated the same process on this front window. To recap, first you need to measure out the size of your plexiglass sheet, then measure the header to make sure it's wide enough to accommodate both side pieces of trim, and ensure everything is square and level when screwing them into place. So with both windows framed out, you can see that this plexiglass is basically going to sit against the inside just like this. Now I use cedar boards rather than regular siding for the headers of the windows because I wanted them to be accent pieces. But if you're using the same trim for all four sides of the windows, you can skip this whole step. But if you do want to use real wood, first you'll need to sand everything down until it's fairly smooth, and I used some 220 grit sandpaper. Then I applied a liberal coat of this pre-stained wood conditioner. This is great when you're using softer woods because it'll help the stain apply more evenly. After about a half an hour, I then applied this bare waterproofing stain and sealer. We went with this chestnut color in semi-transparent. This is the same kind of stuff that you would use on a deck or fence, and it's made to withstand water and the elements. It's a full finish, so you don't need to put any kind of clear coat over it. We applied 2 coats, making sure to wipe off any excess product before it dried on the wood. This should last years before we need to reapply again. In the meantime, I could move on to caulking the edges of the trim. Now for the window, we need to caulk all around the edges. So we're going to do this edge, and then once we put the header in, we're going to go around the top as well. But we're not going to caulk this bottom part. Reason being, if water ever does get in behind this trim, you want a place where it can leak out. So if we caulked here, it could get trapped inside and then rot the wood from behind. So we're going to do that, and then when we put the window in, we're going to put another layer of caulk around the inside, and that one will be clear. I use this Dynaflex Ultra exterior sealant, as well as this caulk spreading tool. This is pretty easy to apply. Just make sure you give a good bead all along the edge. And this tool is super handy. It costs like $4 or $5, and it makes smoothing out the caulk so much easier than using your finger. I also caulked in between the seams where these trim pieces met, and wiped off any excess with a wet rag. Then I could reinstall these new headers back into place with their new finished look. And obviously, as you can tell, I painted the rest of my shed in the meantime. Now, there's a specific way that you need to install these header pieces. First, make sure you use good sized pilot holes that match the size of the screws that you're using. Then, use a countersink bit like this to drill some space in the wood for the screw head, so the wood won't crack when you fully screw it into place. You can see how flush these screws are sitting, and there's no risk of damaging the wood. These headers are standout accent pieces, and so they draw the eye, so I really don't want there to be any damages or blemishes to them. And that's also why I'm using these nice black screws, because they fit with the shed coloring really well. The frames are looking great, and the last step is to install the plexiglass. I did one last test fitting, just making sure that the plexiglass fit flush against our new trim pieces, and then I went ahead and removed both sides of this protective film. I ran a bead of Loctite Premium construction adhesive all along the inside edges of this trim, and then pressed the plexiglass firmly against it. Make sure you really press along the edges so that the construction adhesive can adhere properly. Also, it's important not to use too much because there can be some overspill which can come out on the front side of the plexiglass. If that happens, just make sure to wipe it up before it dries. I then did the same thing on the front window, pressing the plexiglass firmly against all the construction adhesive. You may have to hold the window in place for a bit until the adhesive takes hold, or you can put some screws into it to hold it into place while the glue dries. You definitely need to use a countersink bit for this though, because this plexiglass can crack and you definitely don't want that. So make sure you leave room for the head of the screw. You could also secure these with just screws if you don't want to mess with adhesive at all. I use both though. I think the glue provides a really good additional seal and makes sure that the whole border is adhered to the frame. But all these screws really help keep it in place while it dries. Finally, we need to caulk the inside edge of the window. I'm using this clear sealant. Right now you'll see it's coming out white, but after a few days it'll dry clear so you won't be able to see it. Give all 4 edges a good beat of this caulk to make sure that these windows remain watertight. And I'm telling you, this little spreader tool is the easiest way to get really clean lines like this. But that's the last step of this project, and I think these windows turned out great. This plexiglass costs less than $20 per window, and at that price, I really don't think you can beat this option. These windows add a ton more light to the inside of the shed, and plus, now I've got a great view out the back side. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you found it helpful if you want to add some windows to your own shed or other outdoor building. Make sure to subscribe to catch the next project, and we'll see you next time.